Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King's Quest IV: The Perils of Rosella for various PC systems of the late 80s and early 90s. This is the sequel to King's Quest III to Err is Human. It was released in 1988 and is the first game in the series to actually use the SCI engine that Sierra made. It's pretty much the same idea as the previous games in the series using the AGI engine, but at the same time, the text parser now interrupts the gameplay as opposed to just being at the bottom of the screen and moving along while you type. But it also improved the graphics somewhat. Now, it's not a huge step up, and it looks worse than, of course, King's Quest I's remake, but it still looks a lot better than the previous games in the series. There's more detail to the environments. You can actually kind of tell what things are now instead of just sitting there having to guess. They put in more shading, that sort of thing. So you see these incremental improvements in the visuals over time, and it started to get much better with King's Quest IV, just because technology was improving at the time. But that's not what's most notable about King's Quest IV. What's most notable about it is that you play as Rosella. You are playing as a female protagonist. That is extremely rare in games, even today. And so, for this to happen back in 1988 was just wow. Now, you did have stuff like, of course, Metroid, but that was kind of a reveal at the end. It's like, whoa, that blew my mind. Whereas in this one, you know you're playing as Rosella from the very beginning. So, how does that actually translate into the game? Did they do that pretty well, or what? But that's not really the ultimate question as far as I'm concerned. I never played King's Quest IV back in the day. So, when I got the King's Quest collection, and this was included in it, I was like, ooh, I finally get a chance to play this. So, what do I think about it going into it now that it's been many, many years since the game was released? And I never actually played it back in the day. I don't know why I skipped over this one. It just happened for some reason. But suffice to say, how does it hold up to the previous three games in the series? Now, like I said, they did improve the visuals over the previous games in the series, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. What really matters are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this one is that it actually starts out pretty grim. King Graham suffers a heart attack, and he's dying. And in her grief, Rosella's sitting on the throne, and a voice comes to her through the magic mirror. It belongs to a fairy named Ginesta, who invites her to this land called Tamir in order to get this magic fruit that grows once every 100 years, basically. And this magic fruit has healing properties. But the trick is that Ginesta is getting weaker and weaker by the moment, because this evil fairy, Lalot, stole her magic talisman that gives her power. And so you basically have two objectives through this game, overall objectives, I should say. The first is to get that magic fruit, and the second is to get the talisman back. And the problem is, unlike the previous game in the series, where it kind of directed you towards the objective in the beginning, and it told you what, well, sort of what you could do. It gave you ideas, vague hints, and here and there that would show you, hey, this might be worth looking at. This one doesn't do that as much. And that becomes a problem, because you start off and you don't really know what you're doing. You don't really know where you're supposed to go, or what you're supposed to talk to, or use in particular situations. You have to think more outside the box in this one than you did in the previous games, which is kind of saying something for Sierra Adventures. But when you're talking about the story in this one, it does flow pretty well for the most part, if you know what you're doing. If you don't, then you just get lost, and you just sit there going, what am I doing? Where do I go? And that becomes a pretty big problem, because the game's on a time limit. Yeah, it runs on a time limit. So, on top of that, you have to worry about things going into the day-night cycle in this game. Some things you can only do at night. And so you have to keep a lot in mind while you're playing this game, and it really does help to have a hint system or a walkthrough available to actually play this game. Because otherwise, you'll probably not know what you're supposed to do. It can be pretty obscure sometimes, and that presents a pretty big problem. While the previous games did have some obscureness to them, they still flowed pretty well and made sense. This one requires you to make more just leaps. It's not as bad as it could be, of course, but it's still confusing here and there. And there are some parts of this game that are outright annoying or infuriating, like the cave bit. If you played this game, you know what I'm talking about instantly, and you're probably going, oh no, not the cave bit. The cave bit, you have to go into this cave, which is pitch black. You cannot see anything in this cave, except for Rosella. And when you're trying to navigate this cave, not only is it a maze, to some degree, it's a pretty small maze at least, but it's a maze. It's got a troll in it, and if he makes contact with you at all, you die, and you have to load a save. On top of this, you get to a certain point in the cave, and there's a chasm that you have to bridge, and you bridge this thing, and then you can go across. And that's a pain, because you don't know that there's a chasm there to begin with, and guess what? You're going to fall into the chasm and die. It's guaranteed to happen. And so, when you eventually get through that cave, you have to go, and that's actually where you get the magic fruit. And then you go back, and you have to go back through the cave. And I actually managed to get unlucky to the point of when I went through a screen on one particular part of the cave. When I walked through the screen and got to the next screen transition, the troll spawned right on top of me, and I was just like, no, because then I had to load my save and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until eventually the troll wasn't there. It got incredibly annoying, and that was really the only time that the game design itself got in my way and just laughed at me maniacally like an evil villain or something like that. But it's stuff like that that gets infuriating in this game. And then there's also a lot of staircases you have to navigate, and if you've played these games before, you know that the controls aren't exactly, good. Particularly with navigating stairs, you kind of have to make this weird angling thing where you go at right angles, and it gets really awkward, and when you're on a very narrow staircase, it becomes a pretty big problem, because you're probably going to fall off and die. And they have several of these staircases in this game, and you have to go up and down them, too. And they like to reverse the controls on you when you go one direction or the other. So, it gets confusing and awkward. You have to deal with all this stuff going into this game, and it's just, when you get to those parts, it's annoying. And the actual precision requirements of this game are actually higher than that of the previous games. And it gets annoying. Just outright annoying. So, well, you have this storyline that makes a lot of references to various things of literature and fairy tales and even some horror elements here and there. And it's actually pretty well presented and everything. You have the gameplay, which for the most part is solid, don't get me wrong. But it just has these few parts that are so annoying that it makes it really hard to enjoy. Because they'll be dotted in places that are actually pretty important, and you'll just be going, oh man, why? So, ultimately, the Perils of Rosella is a very mixed bag. On the one hand, it's very easily you can tell it's a well-done adventure game from the time period. And it's certainly a good King's Quest game, but at the same time, it's just got all these annoying parts to it. And even though it does have that charm, you have to be very, very patient with this game and pretty much take a lot of notes, because otherwise you're probably not going to know what you're doing. And so, if you're going into this game and you've never played it before, I recommend at least having a hint book or the UHS hint system or something like that available to you, if not a full walkthrough. Because it can be infuriating sometimes trying to figure out what you're trying to do and navigating these areas and such like that without having some prior knowledge. So, on top of that, it's just hard to recommend this game all around. Because while King's Quest fans will enjoy it, because it's so annoying in certain parts, there are other people who would just really not be able to get into it. So, it's not like the previous game. It's not like King's Quest 3, where I can recommend it to people for getting into parser-based adventure games, because it's pretty accessible. This one isn't as accessible, and it kind of confused me going into it, because I expected it to just build on what King's Quest III did well and make it better. Well, in some ways it did, but in that particular aspect, it didn't. And that's kind of its major downfall. It doesn't really direct the player as well as the previous game did. And that's saying a lot, because the previous game didn't actually direct the player all that much. So, ultimately, again, King's Quest IV is a good game, and I can recommend it to fans of the series and fans of adventure games in general if they're the very patient variety, but it's really hard to recommend it to anybody else. Thanks for watching.